Rachel Moeller is here with us as well, being our man behind the curtain, our gal behind the curtain. So let's get started. I'm going to officially introduce Jennifer Talarico, Department Head and Professor of Psychology. She's a cognitive psychologist who studies memory for personally experienced events. She's published influential work on flashbulb memories, the phenomenon of confidently believing we remember exactly where we were and what we were doing when we learned of important public events. The courses she regularly teaches at Lafayette include cognitive psychology, research design and analysis, and a first-year seminar called Learning Science. That focuses on applying the science of learning for individual students and how institutions historically support student learning. So I think we're in for an interesting session here today. And I am going to turn it over to Jennifer now.
Thank you very much to Amy and to everyone else. It's been very rewarding to see names pop up on the side of my screen here, some of which I recognize. And so it's good to see familiar names, if not familiar faces, or see you in person. But I'm so glad that you're here today. And I'm looking forward to spending at least a little bit of a time this afternoon with you all. Before I share my screen and sort of launch into the presentation, well, actually, why don't I do that? I will launch that, and hopefully you can all see the main screen that has sort of the title, my name, and then a couple of questions that I thought I would sort of seed the audience with. My hope is that this is a very interactive session rather than a straight lecture. So I will get started, and we're going to sort of come back to this screen throughout the afternoon. And at that point, anytime we're sort of on this screen will be a good chance for you to use that raise your hand feature. So again, if you're on a laptop or a desktop, you can sort of hover your mouse towards the bottom of the screen until you see the reaction function, and you can raise your hand. Or if you've typed up a question in the chat, I'll use this sort of home screen as an opportunity to look over to the chat window and see what questions have been posted there as I go. And we can do this in sort of modules for the afternoon. And then that way, hopefully we'll cover some stuff that you're particularly interested in, because I could talk about this stuff, not just for an hour, but for probably all week. So sound good? Can I get some maybe thumbs up reactions to make sure that we all are used to using the reaction function? I love it. All right, cool. So I think probably the most important thing to start with is sort of defining our terms. And so I thought Amy did a really nice job of sort of defining autobiographical memory at the beginning, right? This memory for personally experienced events. And so when we talk about autobiographical memory, it includes what we might think of as episodic memory. So that's memory for episodes, right? Contextual information, where you were and what you were doing at a particular time and place. So there was just a story in the New York Times today about episodic memory and how that's influenced by imagery, some of which we'll talk about today. We also sort of differentiate that from what's called semantic memory, which is memory for factual details. I like the term autobiographical memory because I think of autobiographical memory or memory for our personal lives or events as really a combination of both of those, right? So when I remember my 40th birthday, right, part of that is remembering that I turned 40, right, and or my correct age, or what I was doing on my 40th birthday as differentiated from my 41st birthday, right, and that my birth date is May 28th, right, the particular day of the year, as well as what I was doing on that particular day and time, who I was with, where I was, how I celebrated. And so autobiographical memory includes both those sort of episodic details and those semantic factual details, right? If I just told you that I had a birthday, you would probably assume I had cake, right? And I blew out a candle. That's your semantic factual memory about what is typically included in a birthday. And so when I share my birthday memory, I can sort of assume that you know things about birthdays in general, right? So autobiographical memory is the term I like because I think it's more general and more rich, right? When we describe what it is that we're talking about when we talk about this kind of memory. There we go. When we talk about memory, or even autobiographical memory, I also like to differentiate how we remember from what we remember. So there's a lot going on this slide, but basically this is really meant to illustrate that when you remember something as simple as what you had for breakfast this morning, or as meaningful and maybe more remote, like your Lafayette graduation day, what's happening is a whole brain, whole body, whole person experience. So down in the bottom corner, you see a picture of a whole brain, and you have these little indicator slides that's saying where in the brain we're taking these slices, these pictures. And then on the image here are the sort of, so if I've I've sliced off the front of the brain here at C, and now you're looking straight on, this is where you would see in the brain, and this is the activity, the region of the brain that is most active during this particular point in time. So what I'm showing on the x-axis here is time, right? And this is time from, it says maximal activity in the motor cortex. All that is that when these participants were in the fMRI machine, they were given a cue, meaning what did you have for breakfast, or when did you tell me about your Lafayette graduation? And when they had a memory, when they had successfully retrieved their memory of that event, they pressed a button. So pressing the button is a really clear neural marker, right, of motor cortical activity. And so we time lock everything else that's going on in the brain to that particular motor activity. And so what you see here is before participants press the button, the area of the brain that is most active is the hippocampus. So this is, as I said, the time between when I ask you to retrieve your Lafayette graduation memory until you actually get there. So that's what we call sort of the search process, right? As you actively think back on your life, was that my graduation? Was that my brother's graduation? Was that commencement or convocation? I always get those confused, right? When do I arrive at my particular memory that satisfies this cue? So the hippocampus is really associated with memory, and it's really associated with that search process of sort of retrieving an appropriate memory when and why and where we want to. While that's happening, right, you also see these triangles sort of peak right at the moment of the motor cortex button press. That's an area of the brain called the left prefrontal cortex, which is basically, so left side, that's easy. Prefrontal means it's just before you get to the frontal cortex. And that's a brain region that we think of as strongly associated with personal relevance. So anytime that you are asked to associate something with yourself, that region of the brain becomes highly activated. And so what's going on here, we think, is, again, when you sort of, after your hippocampus is doing that search activity, as you are processing all of the possible things that are coming to mind, as you latch on to the one particular memory of that event, that your Lafayette graduation, it resonates with you, both the event from the past, as well as your assessment of your performance on this task in the present. Yes, I have met the demands that this experimenter is asking of me in the here and now. And so left prefrontal cortex activity is, really high in the beginning, and actually stays kind of high as we recollect that graduation memory. The other thing that becomes more active as time goes on, at the bottom of this graph, is our visual cortex, way back in the back of our brain. And what this is associated with is that phenomenon of, as I reflect back on my Lafayette graduation, I can see the quad or Fisher Field, depending on when you graduated. I can see the commencement speaker on stage. I can hear the sights and sounds. I can recall what the weather was like. I can picture that event in my mind's eye and relive the experience in the past, in the present. And so that recollective phenomenon is also really strongly associated with autobiographical remembering in a way that is not really associated with factual remembering, right? So knowing that you went to Lafayette doesn't necessarily involve all of that emotion and recollection necessarily, but remembering a particular event at Lafayette while you were a student is often accompanied by that imagery, that reminiscence, that emotion. So that's the sort of how we remember, right? What's going on while we're remembering an event like this? What about the what are we remembering? Well, autobiographical memory also has different levels of sort of detail, if you will. And so if you think about your entire autobiography, right, your whole life includes lots of different aspects. So if we think about broad themes, for example, like work and family or personal relationships, you're going to have lots of different events that form the narrative within that domain. So if we think about in your work theme, we also might think about temporally or chronologically different time periods as we go through our lives. So my college years, my first job, my second job, my retirement, right? Those might all be temporal markers throughout my autobiography. Then we have this sort of, what I think most of us think of, certainly what we as cognitive psychologists, our sort of modal unit of analysis, are event memory, are events, right? So things like the interview or moving to Easton, and for thinking about my first job memory, right? Or the first classes that I taught. And so those are events that are usually on the scale of hours, maybe days. You can have extended events like a trip or a vacation. Within that are episodes, right? So episodes are usually more on the order of sort of minutes to hours, right? So being picked up from the airport, right? Meeting my first colleague for the first time, right? Might be a particular episode that unfolded over a matter of minutes or hours. And the very lowest level are these sensory or perceptual details. So things like remembering what the weather was like, or again, what something sounded like, what it felt like, what I was seeing in my visual field. And so those individual components we can also think about as sort of being influenced by what it is that we're remembering. So everything else that we talk about today is basically going to be one of these two things, right? It's going to be how we remember, or it's going to be what we remember, and how those two dimensions of autobiographical memory are influenced by all of the weird, unusual, disruptive challenges that we have been experiencing during 2020 and during this past year. So that's sort of what I alluded to earlier, where we're going to sort of come back to this home screen, and we will sort of pause now, and I will take a look at my second screen and see if there are any hands raised using the raise hand feature or anything in the app. Once I've started the captions, unfortunately, they're going to go for the duration, so that they're included in the recording, so that the recording is accessible to screen readers and things like that. So I apologize if that's disruptive, but I've hopefully planned the slides so that the images are above the moving captions. But any other questions or? All right. Well, I have, like I said, some CEDAR questions here. So things like, how will we remember the start and the end of the COVID-19 pandemic? How will our social groups shape our memories of this past year? How will we remember events that we missed? That's what I think many of us were experiencing, not doing things, but the absence of doing things. How are memories for those events shaped? What about the emotional influence on memory? Age influences on memory? So why don't we start maybe by using those same reaction features. So again, if you go either to the bottom of your screen, the Zoom screen, if you're on a laptop or desktop, or at the top right, if you're using an iPad, in addition to the raise hand feature and the sort of emoji features, you should see a green check mark, a yes, and a red X, no. So we're going to use those to vote. So I'm just going to pick, because I'm leading the screen. Use the green check mark if you want to hear about how we'll remember the start and the end, and the red X if you want to hear about how we'll remember events that were missed. I'm going to scrolling down my screen, trying to peruse, seeing mostly green check marks. All right, and lots of abstentions, which I'm going to assume you're all Lafayette students and you're game for everything, and that's what I love about you. So let's start with talking about how we might remember the start and the end of the pandemic. So when we think about our life story, we have to think about these events and these episodes, right? And one natural question is, how do we know when one event ends and another begins? Or when one episode ends and another episode begins? And so really, we mark those beginnings and endings in terms of transitions. And those transitions are disruptions to people, right? So people join us or they might depart, right? So people coming or going, replacing. Places, right? So again, that can be at a low level, right? After dinner, we retire to the living room, or it can be, last week I was in Easton, this week I'm in Pittsburgh, right? So big picture changes. Objects, again, both immediate, if we're talking about episodes. So, before I ate dinner, I had a full plate of food. After I finished my dinner, the plate was empty. To larger scale events, moving houses, right? So maybe I'm still in the same city, but now I've moved from one house to another house. Right? And also changes to activities can mark beginnings and endings. So I went to an amusement park and first I rode the roller coaster and then I rode the Ferris wheel and then I had a funnel cake. And each of those activities are going to be individual episodes in the event of going to the amusement park. And that change of going to the amusement park is obviously a very different place than maybe my normal day-to-day experience. And so that will demarcate that event from other events in my daily life. So that's how we tend to mark beginnings and endings, is really has to do more with the content, like the what than the how necessarily. We don't really have a great sense of the temporal markers or sort of the neural markers that come with event transitions. It really does seem to be more about what you're experiencing as people, the psychological, the behavioral stuff. So when we think about transitions, those transitions are memorable, right? So transitions can be things I've alluded to, moving, maybe changing jobs, traveling abroad, right? So big picture transitions. We can also think about turning points. Turning points don't necessarily have to be physical changes. They can be psychological changes. So again, we might still think about a job change, so a promotion where you're still working at the same place, but now you have a different title, you have different job responsibilities. We can think about losing a loved one. We can think about, again, graduation, academic changes, things of that nature. These big sort of landmark transitions. So even if our day-to-day experience doesn't change, there's some, again, internal or external marker that has changed, that we interpret or feel as a change. And then there are also what we identify as transition-linked turning points. So these are clearly changes, right, transitions that also have both that psychological and that material change. So getting married, right, you are integrating a new person into your life, into your family, into your home often, right? So that is likely to be a transition-linked turning point. Not necessarily, right? Perhaps you are cohabitating for a lengthy time. Perhaps that maybe is just a simple turning point, right? A legal change, not a transition. And for you, maybe the transition of moving in with a partner was maybe a more substantive material change, and the legal change wasn't as psychologically meaningful. But in a transition-linked turning point, both of those things happen simultaneously, both the material and the psychological, right? Having a baby, right? Again, bringing someone new into your home, expanding your family, often lots of material change comes with introducing a child into your home. And also obviously lots of psychological change, role changes, becoming a parent, changing relationships among siblings, among partners, etc. And you will also notice I have the same image here, right, of a job change. Job change might also be a transition linked turning point. Maybe you have chosen to explore a different career path. So it's not just a different job at the same place or the same job with a different company, but it's really a change of your role, right? I used to be a college professor and now I'm a consultant, right? Something like that. I'm taking on dramatic changes both to the nature of the work and the work itself, right? The location, the people, the places, etc. The reason these distinctions are important is because they have implications for how we remember these kinds of events. So how you remember a particular job change will be influenced by whether that job change is a transition, a turning point, or a transition linked turning point. So, a transition linked turning point is associated more strongly with enhancements in the way in which we remember, right? The how we remember. It comes with more vivid imagery. It comes with more stronger recollection and reliving, and it comes with more emotionality. It's also used more as a marker of sort of before after transitions, right? So, if I'm thinking about a trip to a place, is that before we had our children or after we had our children, right? So those transition linked turning points are more likely to become anchors. Doesn't mean transitions and turning points individually don't also serve that function. They do, but when you have the combination of material and psychological, that's when those events are the most likely to become more strongly remembered within your sort of autobiographical narrative. Interestingly, if we think about public events, things that happen out in the world, it really has much more to do with those day-to-day changes than it has to do with big picture psychological change. So what I'm showing here, this is data from a study my colleague Norman Brown did, looking at participants' memories for just asking them about memories for their lives that during the period that coincided with World War II, right? So you can see, we think in that period, and this is again a cross-national study. So Netherlands, Denmark, Canada, and the US. And what you basically see if you look just at the top two figures is even though Netherlands and Denmark were highly involved, the sites of battles, invaded by the Germans, these were dramatically influenced by the events of World War II, by the European theater. The Dutch were much more likely to include references to historical events in their personal narratives relative to the Danes. It's not that the Danes didn't do it at all, or even Canadians who are much more like the Americans, right? They would occasionally refer to public events, but it was more when those public events intruded upon daily experience, right? When my physical space was harmed or changed in some way, when people I was personally close to, my family, my neighbors, were directly influenced. That is when you saw the intrusion of public events into the structure of personal memories. And in the absence of that, it's not that people don't know, right? I'm not claiming that Canadians and the Danes and the Americans don't know the facts about World War II. They, if asked, they can certainly describe ways in which those events influence their daily life. But it's when asking them to describe their personal memories, they don't spontaneously include reference to public events unless those public events intruded on their personal lives at the time in a really direct way. So what does this mean about the COVID-19 pandemic? I think, and I've said in other contexts, I think it's going to be really important for us communally and also individually to celebrate markers of the end, to mark those transitions into or out of quarantine, right? I know I have a stronger memory for the last day I taught an in-person class, right? That was a really important change to my daily life as a result of the pandemic. Doesn't mean that the pandemic wasn't happening before that, and certainly doesn't mean, there weren't other transitional changes after that. But that's one really strong, I would argue, transition link turning point for me as an individual that clearly served as a marker for sort of the beginning. And I think it will be equally important for us to be cognizant of, and perhaps even to create markers of the end, right? So particularly because as we transition out of this pandemic, those transitions are more gradual and more individual, right? So when each of us got our vaccine will be very idiosyncratic, whether you got the single dose or a two-dose stage and how that unfolded. Your personal feeling with that or reaction to receiving that vaccine, whether you were working for the duration of this and how the nature of your work changed as a consequence of the pandemic and of social distancing and other kinds of safety and health and safety measures. And when those go away, right, we're seeing things done. We saw things added piecemeal. We're seeing things being withdrawn piecemeal. And I think that to mark the end and to really have a sense of moving on and the sort of after times, I think it will be important for us to have end celebrations, right? To mark certain events. And you're seeing some of that from public figures or from social communities. But if you haven't taken steps to do that yet, I would encourage you to, right? To plan what will be the thing I'm looking forward to that I haven't done, for 2020 that I want to do and can now do because I'm fully vaccinated, because, X, Y, or Z has occurred that makes me feel safe, that I'm on the other side of this particular pandemic. So now we'll come back here, and I did see somebody had something in the chat. I see I'm out of practice. Let me...
Jennifer, someone mentioned that they were having a reopening celebration at work on July 1st. So exactly to your point.
I love that. I love the
Donna.
idea of a reopening ceremony, right? Of celebrating that this is a time when we can come back together. We can appreciate the opportunity to be together again in a workplace. Others are talking about the start of the pandemic because of other things that were unfolding. And so, yes, this, again, confluence of circumstances that can come together to exaggerate that whole sort of momentary instance. Yeah. Yeah, it will be interesting. I mean, a lot of people are talking about what we will bring with us from the pandemic, what lessons we will have learned, how we will adapt moving forward. And I am curious to see what we will keep and what we will give up, right? What we will be happy to lose and what we will be happy to return to. But I do think it's going to be important to identify a moment, right? I think when we have things that have fuzzy boundaries, that does make it more difficult to remember the experience, to remember either the episode, but also the event, right? So think, project yourself into the future 20 years. How will you talk to young people, current Lafayette students at that time who did not experience 2020, right? In 2040, how will you talk about this with them? And I think we will be able to understand it ourselves now and in the moment and be able to explain it better in the future if we are attentive to those beginnings and those endings and thinking about what made that middle, right, different from the either side. So why don't let's do the Sort of pull everybody's faces up, or names at least. And I still see some reactions from before. So if you can take away your yes and your no from the previous vote. And then I think they're all gone. We will use the, there we go, the green check mark to answer the question, how will we remember events that were missed? And the red X to answer the question about how our social groups will shape our memories. So green, missed events, red X, social groups. Couple people for social groups. We'll do that next, I promise. All right, so in the meantime, we will do events that were missed due to the pandemic. So again, I think that's what makes this particular experience of 2020 so unusual, is that it was this absence, right? We all felt a loss. We all felt omission, I think, more than addition or change or disruption. Clearly there was all of that. And clearly I'm generalizing dramatically. Those of us who lost family members, either due to the pandemic or just in the context of that pandemic, and our rituals were disrupted, that is going to be very different kind of disruption and omission. I think a very, very potentially traumatic one, but certainly a very challenging one. There is a reason that societies and cultures have developed rituals around the kinds of transitions and the turning point, that transition-linked turning points that we were just talking about. And so the omission of those rituals, of those habits, of those routines, of those opportunities, I think is really going to have a fundamentally change the way in which we deal with, say, the loss of a loved one, right? In the absence of a funeral, in the absence of the opportunity to come together with family, friends, and loved ones, the memory of that loss and the acceptance of that transition is going to be very challenging. So that is one particular type of missed event that I think is going to be really influential. But the good news is that when we think about our day-to-day experience, much of what we do in our daily lives is rather repetitive, right? We eat 3 meals a day, we're students, right? We have 4 classes a semester. We hopefully have rich and varied social lives that we connect with various people. We go to different places, right? Clearly I have some images here to indicate, travels far and wide. But even in our normal daily lives, right, we go home, we go to work, we go to the grocery store, we go to different places throughout our day, but we go to those same places over and over and over again, right? We eat the same kinds of things, we hang out with the same kinds of people, we go to the same kinds of places and do the same kinds of things. So even though I said we use the changes or of disruptions of people, places, objects, and activities to mark individual episodes, it's also the case that those collections of people, places, activities, and objects recur. And we develop what we call schemas, right? A sort of generalized memory of a type of event, right? So that right now, if I were to ask you, what is it like to attend a Lafayette College class, right? You're all alums, you haven't done that for at least a couple of years, but you can recollect what a Lafayette class is typically like. You can picture a particular room, maybe, but maybe it's not a specific room. Maybe it's not Oxley 211, right? Maybe it's just a room that has some desks and a blackboard or whiteboard or computer screen at the front, right? And lots of individual people in that room. Maybe people are sitting around in a circle, maybe it's a giant auditorium, but the idea is you have a general sense of what a classroom, what a class is like, right? What foods you tend to like, places you tend to go, people you tend to, how you tend to socialize, right? And so although the pandemic was disruptive to most, if not all of these things, what many of us found is that reduction in sort of day-to-day change, right? Everything was the same, right? There was no longer a commute to work. It was walking from one room of the house to the other room of the house, right? So yes, that changed, but I still developed a schema for teaching a virtual class. It's very different than teaching an in-person class, but I now have a sense of what teaching virtual classes is like. And so over the course of this pandemic, I think what we have often seen is the development of new schemas, right? And new ways of socializing. It's not getting together to eat at a restaurant, but it might be getting together at a Zoom meeting chat. Maybe it's not traveling abroad, but maybe it's rediscovering different hiking trails in our backyard that we didn't know, but we were encouraged to find, right, as a way to get out and develop a change of scenery, right, and to do so safely under our current constraints. So it's not so much about what we missed. I think it's about how we adapted or changed what we typically did to the current constraints. And I think, again, projecting into the future, we will remember or recollect the time of the pandemic because those schemas will be so different from our normal sort of the pre and the post pandemic dining out memories are going to be very different than the during pandemic dining out memories, right? If you had that. That's all, of course, assuming that your day-to-day life was disrupted in a meaningful way. Certainly for many individuals, particularly frontline workers, those in deemed essential workers who were still out in the world, the nature of the changes to their routine were going to be much smaller, right? Adding a mask, adding a temperature check when you started work, adding additional cleaning routines, those kinds of things probably, again, we may have a schema for what health and safety precautions we took during that pandemic, right? Wearing a mask, I think, is something, an activity that many of us will sort of fundamentally associate with this time period, even those of us who may continue to do so during cold and flu season far into the future. But certainly the day-to-day, wearing the mask every time I leave the house is something that will be highly associated with this pandemic period, with that temporal period. But so I don't think that it's so much about what we missed as much as what we changed or what we adapted. Again, with the giant asterisk associated with the kinds of truly sort of sociocultural markers like funerals, like weddings, those kinds of events that had to be postponed or changed or omitted and completely, I think will really be fundamentally remembered in a very different way and always sort of tinged with this particular association with this particular time. There's one other sort of aspect of remembering events that didn't happen that I also want to talk about. So you think about, again, how events are remembered, the images that we bring to mind, the details that we recall, et cetera, right? Typically those memories are brought to mind, right, in response to a retrieval cue. We talked about that earlier, right? So if I ask you about your Lafayette graduation, you'll be able to picture that in your mind's eye. You will have a memory for that event, certainly in response to my question, but also because the event occurred, right? You did graduate from Lafayette, right? You had a commencement ceremony of some type. But it is also the case that we can have the feeling of a memory, right? We can have those same vivid images, we can have those same episodic details in the absence of an event that actually occurred. But instead of being in response to a retrieval cue, being in response to a suggestion. So this is a phenomenon called false memories. So these are memories for events that did not occur. And this will be really interesting, I think, to see how, if this phenomenon occurs for this duration, right? Because it is the case that many of us experienced this time very differently. Again, particularly depending on the nature of your work and whether your work changed dramatically right? So it went from in-person to fully remote, whether you lost your job because of pandemic conditions. So you went from being employed to not employed, or whether your work changed very little, but maybe became very, much higher stress, right? So you were a hospital worker or a grocery worker that was accepted much more exposure to this risk, even though your day-to-day life, you still went to work, you still went to the same place, you still interacted with the same people. Now you just wore some PPE, right? So I think whether or not people come to misremember, right, falsely remember this period of time as we come back out of the pandemic, as we begin to re-socialize with larger and wider groups of individuals, many of whom did experience this period very differently than you may have or I may have, that how those conversations and how those recollections, how as we start to see media, whether that's novels, TV shows, films, articles, things written about the event, how those narratives will shape our memory for our own experience. It's a really open question and something that I'm really interested in seeing how that happens as we re-enter 2021 and 2022 and beyond. It's a phenomenon that we know that happens. There's lots of very good evidence for false memories to exist. They are often indistinguishable to the individual, even in cases where they can be shown to be false, right? So when a given participant or individual, I should say, is told and shown evidence, right? Irrefutable evidence that the event that they believe to have happened, right, that they remember didn't occur, often what people are left with is still that memory, right? They can still see it in their mind's eye, they can still recollect it, they can still have that feeling of reminiscence, even when they know that it's false. We call those non-believed memories. And so this dissociation between belief in what I recollect and the recollection itself is something that we as autobiographical memory researchers are really starting to tease apart right now in a really interesting, well, obviously I'm biased, in a really interesting way to try and think about that, how we remember and what we remember, and this sort of intersection of those two things and how they can be, as I said, sort of teased apart, and thinking about the ways in which different kinds of these influences can shape either of those two processes and the interaction between them. So I saw my chat number did up at one point. Yeah, graduations, reunions. I don't know, Jeff, what I was saying when you expanded and gave better examples probably than I gave, but thank you for that. Oh, things we missed. Oh, yes. So again, it's not that, I think it's really, I would want to push back on the idea that we really missed. Yes, we missed a commencement ceremony, but the class of 2021 or the class of 2020 did graduate, right? They did finish, they did, there was a transition there. It was different. It was very, very different. And there are lots of things we missed. We missed celebrating birthdays with one another. We missed celebrating holidays with one another. There are lots of things that we missed doing the way we had done before. But many of us did things slightly differently, right? We re-engineered how we observed and how we celebrated, I think is a great way of putting it. And so thinking about how we reshaped those things. What was it that was important? What could we have? What could we not? What could we make the best of? What could we adapt? And what did we really miss, right? What was the missing element? Why do we feel that certain types of events were missed, right? And how can we appreciate those aspects of particular events moving forward, right? I think is maybe a way I would want to think about it. So I said I promised my Red X folks that I would talk a little bit about social groups. So let's do that. So social groups, I mean here everything from very small social groups, so your family or your friend group, to very large social groups. So nationality, gender, race, ethnicity, age group, right? Collegiate affiliation, right, would be a social group, right? I think most of us would think of Lafayette, folks as different social group than Lehigh folks, right? We have different social groups that occur at different levels of analysis or different levels of identity. And it turns out each of those levels of identity do shape our individual memories. So Amy very kindly said during the introduction, I've done some work on flashbulb memories, which she defined as, and I would define as, very vivid, very confidently held memories of where you were and what you were doing when something important, emotional, public event occurred, when you learned about that event. So one of the sort of most relevant or example more recently would be, where were you when you found out about September 11th? That example is sadly becoming more and more distant to my actual Lafayette students. Hopefully for an alumni group that still resonates, that you can still have a personal memory for where you were and what you were doing when you learned of that terrible event. To make a sort of give you a sillier example, all forest animals to this very day remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard that Bambi's mother had been shot, right? This is the phenomenon, right? The idea that even though you may not have been there at the event, right? You may not have been in the towers. You may not have even been in New York City. You may not have even been in the US, right? During September 11th, 2001, but you have a memory of how you heard about that event. And we know that social group membership influences how we remember these public events, because it's not the case that every important public event leads to flashbulb memories, right? Think about just news coverage, right? Not everything that happens in the world makes it to the nightly news, right? Their choices are made as to what is relevant to a particular audience. The same is true in reverse. We as individuals, certain news items, certain public events either resonate with us or they don't. So this is from an older study in the 70s. It's actually the paper that coined the term flashbulb memories. And so you can see here, the vast majority of individuals, these were all Americans, they were all from the New England area, had a flashbulb memory for where they were and what they were doing when they learned that JFK had been assassinated. Fewer people had a memory for learning about Martin Luther King's assassination. And of those, Black Americans were much more likely to have a flashbulb memory than were white Americans. Not to say that no whites had a flashbulb memory, but they were less likely to than were African Americans. And that is clearly demonstrated in the flashbulb memories of the assassination of Medgar Evers, where only African Americans had flashbulb memories for that event. And again, not even the majority of African Americans had a flashbulb memory of that event, but of the people that had a flashbulb memory, they were from that community, not the white community, right? So we know that these are important, consequential public events, and we know that there is variability in how we remember them based on our social groups. And so the reason for that is that we think that, again, when an event happens, we identify whether or not that is important to us, right? Not just to me as a person, but to me as a member of a group, right? In the case of 9/11, is this important to me as an American, right? Well, my national identity will be very different than, my gender identity might not have been as relevant, right, to that event. Might have been more relevant to other newsworthy events, but not to that one. Once I believe this event is relevant, right, I recognize its relevance, its importance, then I have an emotional reaction, right? Surprise, fear, trauma, anger, whatever that emotional reaction is. It's also important that this be relevant to a social group, because we often have this compulsion really to process, to talk about, oh my gosh, did you hear about such and such? Did you hear what's going on with so-and-so? Right, that rehearsal, having people with whom to talk about this event. And also the way we think about events is shaped by our membership in these social groups. And so we hear the news event, We have an emotional reaction to it. We talk and think about it, the event and our emotional reactions to it, and our memory for where we were and what we were doing. And those processes lead to this phenomenon of a lifelong, very vivid, very detailed, relatively accurate memory of where we were and what we were doing. And what I really like about Dorta Bernson's model here is it also has this sort of feedback loop at the bottom of the screen where having the flashbulb memory itself becomes sort of proof of your membership in the social group. So certainly you would be hard pressed to find an American of a certain age, right? Where you said, hey, where were you when, what's your 9/11 memory, right? Where were you when you found out about that? And they said, I don't know, can't remember, don't know, wasn't important, right? No recollection. You'd be a sort of poor patriot. There's lots of social pressure to, and I'm not saying that this is a conscious act. I'm not saying people are lying when they tell you they have flashbulb memory. I'm saying that all of those processes are in play at when the event occurs and serve to reinforce and maintain that memory over time. But it's also really relevant in sort of smaller social groups. So if any of you are members of sporting fandoms, right, having a memory for important events that happened to your team is sort of how you prove your membership that I'm a real fan, right, not a bandwagon jumper, right, if I remember this particular sporting event, right? So those kinds of memories can serve to bolster our membership in the social group, and our membership in the social group is what leads to our development of these kinds of memories. Here's a different kind of example, again, sort of a national level event, the Challenger disaster. So this is the Challenger space shuttle prior to takeoff. For those of you that don't remember, this is a noteworthy shuttle launch because it included the first civilian to be on a spacecraft. Krista McAuliffe was a school teacher. And tragically, shortly after the shuttle launched, it basically exploded and all of the astronauts on board were killed. So here are two flashbulb reports about learning of that event. So in case you can't read what's on the screen, when I first heard about the explosion, I was sitting in my freshman dorm room with my roommate. We were watching TV. It came on a news flash and we were both totally shocked. I was really upstairs and I went upstairs to talk to a friend and then called my parents. The second report, I was in my religion class and some people walked in and started talking about it. I didn't know any details except that it had exploded and the school teacher's students had been watching, which I thought was so sad. And then after class, I went to my room and watched the TV program talking about it, and I got all the details there. So you can see very vivid, very detailed, long lasting, but what's interesting about these two reports is that they're both from the same person. Flashbulb report B was recorded within a week, actually within 2 days maybe of the event itself. And then flashbulb account A was what the same person reported about 2.5 years later. So you can see that even though these memories are very detailed, they're very vivid, they're not perfectly accurate. Myself and my colleague, my former PhD advisor, David Rubin, we did a similar study inspired by the Challenger study by my colleagues Neisser and Harsh for 9/11, where we asked participants not just about how they heard about 9/11, but also how they heard what they had done the prior weekend, just a personal memory. And then we tracked different groups of individuals, either a week, 6 months, or about a year later, and asked them to write out their memories, just like you see above. And we showed that both types of memories lose detail, right? We change information, right? We lose particular details. Some of those are the introduction of inconsistencies. Right? We said we were with Susie, and then later we say we were with Tommy. But often it's really just the omission of certain information that we had included originally. And that is true both for personal sort of mundane events and for these consequential public events. So even though, and what I'm showing over on the right, we feel like these memories are really vivid and really detailed, they really are. There are a lot of detail. They are very vivid. We feel that way for these public events, but less so for personal events. that we are willing to acknowledge sort of goes away over time. So I could obviously talk more about all of these things, but I want to be cognizant of your time and all of the other wonderful reunion events that Rachel and Amy and the rest of their team have put together for you. So thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry that we didn't have as much maybe interaction as I had hoped, but hopefully we had some. And I'm certainly willing to stick around and answer questions. But if you have to go, no offense taken. And I thank you so much for sharing this hour with me this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. I think, Rachel and I were adding our comments in the chat of our flashbulb memories because they both took place at Lafayette in different scenarios. So thought that was, interesting to share with this particular collective group. If anyone does have questions, still have time for you to tape them into the chat, or if you want to take yourself off mic and have a question or make your own observation. Don't want to not hear from you if you've been waiting to speak up.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your research and your expertise with us. I think we all are going to carry our own memories about the pandemic and all of the various changes that we've gone through well into the future. So it'd be interesting to maybe have you do a follow-up, in another year or two or so at our next reunion. And
that's what's interesting about memory, right? It changes over time. So maybe next year, Remembering 2020 will be the title into 2021, 2, 3, 4, and well beyond. And I hope that you all continue to join me for those conversations.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. We hope that you are going to be participating in other sessions throughout the week. Please take a look at those on reunion.lafayette.edu, and you can link to the Socio app. Lots of great offerings in the days ahead. So we hope to see you virtually and eventually in person. Thanks, Rachel, too. And thank you, Professor Talarico.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.